All right, so busy week. Had a bunch going on, so only going to do the one Q&A. And it's kind of an interesting question, which is, what limits the size of a muscle fiber? So this is a really interesting question, and I'm going to address it not only in terms of muscle fiber, which is the original question, but also in terms of like total muscle growth, because I think it's essentially the same thing. And the short answer to this question is, I don't know, and neither does anyone else. But the long answer is, there's a lot of speculation. So I'm going to look at that instead. But first. So the reality that many do not want to accept is that as a natural individual, whether your goal is bodybuilding or sports or powerlifting or whatever, there is an upper limit to how much muscle you can gain that is set genetically, biologically, physiologically. Once you get there, you're not going to get past it unless you bring in drugs. And especially in America, people don't want to believe this, predominantly because we are told that if you work hard enough, you can achieve whatever you want. And that's wrong. It simply is. There is an upper limit above which people are not going to get. Always argue shit like, well, you don't know my work ethic. I'm sorry, your genetics don't care about your work ethic. And if you want to look at bodybuilders, if you want to see naturals, go to a natural local show. And the majority of people, the biggest weight class will be like the 165 pounders, which is 75 kilos, who by most standards they're not that big. You will see some smaller guys who are short. You will see some bigger guys. And as far as if you're looking at super heavyweights, who are up in the 200, 220 range, if they're ripped, if they're really in shape, that's an exception. So if it were just as easy as work hard to get past your genetic limits, that wouldn't be the case. And there are upper limits. Now, the research has shown that there's like an upper limit of 100 pounds of lean body mass, and that's not even skeletal muscle mass, but I'm not getting into that. It doesn't matter how hard you work. Once you're at your genetic limit, you cannot surpass your genetic limit because that's not what the word limit means. The question is, what is it? And also, how long does it take you to get there? Now, the first question I think is a little bit more difficult. I have thrown out values for a bunch of years that over some time period, the average person, and I would change my wording on this, might gain 40 to 45 pounds of muscle over a career. That's 18 to 20 kilos. It's somewhere in that range. I would amend that. That's probably more of a maximum than an average, because realistically, some people won't gain that much. And I'm sure there will be outliers that gain more. Let me just mention that women will be about half that in terms of how much total muscle they can gain. And when you start looking at the actual muscle mass of female trainees, or lean body mass rather, which includes muscle mass, it's about that, right? So a male might get 40 to 45 if he's lucky. A female might get 20 if she's lucky, and many may not even get that. Obviously, I'm making some pretty big assumptions here. Like, I'm presuming that the person is going to work their ass off to their upper limits. And I'm not somebody just going to like go in and do recreational weight training and gain 4 or 5 pounds of muscle for a woman and 10 or 15 for a man and then be happy with that. I'm not about someone absolutely trying to maximize their muscle growth. That's about the maximum values you're going to see, 40 to 45 pounds for men and about half that for women. And here again, I hate that I have to keep making caveats on this, but people are so intent on misrepresenting what I'm saying. I'm not talking about high school, right? People be like, oh, I trained this high school kid and he gained 40 fucking pounds. Well, half of that was fat, Mark. Ripto. But regardless, I'm not talking about pubertal growth, which happens no matter what you do, right? Puberty is essentially a natural steroid cycle. I'm talking about adult growth after you have gone through puberty and you start lifting consistently over some period of time. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about how much muscle can be gained above and beyond what you would gain at puberty. And again, there's genetic differences. Usually people who are big when they're in high school tend to be bigger later. There's probably ethnic differences. And I'm absolutely not going to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. If you're lucky, you might gain 40 to 45 pounds of muscle over a career. If you're not, you're going to gain less than those. And we don't know that. But what's the time frame? So one hilarious review study looked at this, and its title was Counts BR Muscle Growth to Infinity and Beyond, Muscle Nerve 2017, Volume 56, blah, blah, blah. So this was a little review paper, and it was sort of looking at like time course of growth for upper body and lower body muscles, and it looked at a whole bunch of studies and what percentage growth was seen at that time over different time frames and blah, blah, blah. And they then talked about like how much muscle growth you could get, and here was their hilarious conclusion. These studies support the hypothesis that a large percentage of an individual's muscle growth potential will likely be achieved within the first 3 months, 12 weeks of training. It seems unlikely that individuals will increase their muscle mass by appreciable amounts beyond what is gained by the time of plateau. However, most of these studies were performed for durations of 6 to 12 weeks. A longer study duration would be required to test this hypothesis. And, well, bullshit. This fails the reality check on so many levels. I mean, this fails reality check on other studies that have used trained beginners who, I mean, it may take them 6 months for a female trainee to gain 3 to 4 pounds of muscle and men to gain about double that. And we even know that significant muscle size increases don't even start to occur for a little while. And this belies reality, which is that people continue growing to some degree for much longer than that. So let me go back to that earlier value and let's talk about time frames. When I've written about this, I've typically thrown out some time frames. And I'd mentioned some people don't use absolute numbers. They use, percentages of current body weight in terms of what can be gained per month over a number of different time periods, but whatever, right? Typically, all right, so let's say I had 2 trainees, one male, one female, post-pubertal growth. I'm going to train them perfectly from day 1 until they stop growing, the end of their lifting career. What would I expect as a maximum? All right, so year 1, you're looking at about 20 to 25 pounds for men and about half that, 10 to 12 pounds for women at an absolute maximum. Again, some may gain a little more, some gain a little bit less, but in that range. Going into year 2, I'd expect about half that value. So the male trainee down to about 10 to 12 pounds. About a pound a month, and the woman 5 to 6 pounds, so about half a pound a month. Going into year 3, you're looking at half again, 5 to 6 pounds for the male trainee, so maybe half a pound a month, and half that, 2 to 3 pounds for the woman, so was that a quarter pound a month? It's a whole lot of nothing. And finally, year 4, the man maybe 2 to 3 pounds, so like a quarter pound a month, and the woman is like 1 to 2 pounds if she's lucky, and too little to really for it to matter, quite honestly. By year 4, maybe a tiny bit earlier, maybe a little bit later, just depends, right? We're talking averages. That's about what you're going to get. So 3 months, bullshit. People clearly grow for, at least the first year, and then things slow down. And if you look even at the percentages people have thrown out, in turn, they usually, the first year percentages get halved in the second year, halved again in the third year, and then by 4th year, I mean, you look at these, natural pro bodybuilders, they're scraping for a year, training their brains out to get, a pound if they're lucky. So about 4 years, and you're going to be at your limits as a natural. And the only way to get past that is drugs, but I'm not going to talk about that. So then the question becomes, why? Why is there a limit? What stops the muscle fiber from continuing to grow to infinity and beyond? Again, I don't have an answer, but there's some speculation. And to look at that, I'm going to look at the following paper. So this is by Kataoka R. et al. The Plateau in Muscle Growth, Resistance Training, and Exploration of Possible Mechanisms. Sports Medicine, 2024, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not going to walk through this paper, word by word. This would take absolutely forever. But basically, they look at sort of the mechanisms of what turns on muscle growth acutely. And looking at those factors gives us the ability to look at, what might be changing in any of them at any given point that might be limiting growth in the long term. So we know that, we have to generate some number of mechanical high-tension muscular contractions, and through costomeres and titans, this attaches to focal adhesion kinase probably, and then turns on an enzyme, and then that eventually activates something called mTOR, which is the mechanistic target of rapamycin. And then there's a bunch of downstream stuff, and we get gene signaling that gets turned on. And if you remember high school biology, right, genes code for proteins. Proteins are made through ribosomes, and then these are integrated into muscle fibers, and that's sort of how they get bigger. So the question is, like, where in this step might there be limitations? And this paper, again, looks at it in a speculative fashion in terms of a number of things that might be going on. So one of them that has been shown fairly repeatedly is that with loading, with consistent training, some of those markers and those triggers of growth and gene expression become refractory to loading, which means they no longer get the same increase from training that they otherwise would. Now, I have to go look at all the papers, and I'm just not going to do that. A question that always comes up in my mind is the training progressive? Because in a lot of these studies, like, these things become refractory to a stimulus after like 7 workouts. And clearly people continue growing beyond that. So is it a matter of progression, overload, tension? Does that keep things going? And I mentioned that does tend to be specific. If you take endurance athletes who also see a plateau in VO2 max and endurance performance, and you have them do a resistance training workout, they are essentially naive to resistance training, and they get a big increase in the resistance training markers. And if you take a weight-trained athlete and expose them to an aerobic stimulus, same thing. They are essentially naive to it. So it's very specific to the type of training being done. So we get that increase, and there's still debate over how related those things are to actual growth. Right? There was even some early question about, do those early increases in muscle protein synthesis or acute increases, do those correlate to growth? And the early studies said no, it didn't. But then a paper by, I want to say is either Damas or Dankel, found that the reason for it, which is in the first 3 weeks in short-term training studies, first 3 weeks there's an increase in protein synthesis and breakdown. And until that goes away, there is no relationship between acute increases in protein synthesis and actual muscle growth. And after that goes away, after the muscle damage stops occurring, because damage has nothing to do with growth, they are related. So that might be part of it, that the muscle simply becomes refractory to further stimulus. Now, there's also some research that people are trying to argue for, that if you detrain, if you take a couple weeks off, those markers start to go up like they did before. And people are using it to go, oh, you're resensitizing things to growth. But it's just as likely that's just detraining, because the fibers shrink. And none of the studies have shown that that actually makes you get bigger than training continuously. So it might explain muscle memory, although that's probably epigenetic. It might explain a lot of things. But does resensitizing give you more potential for growth or to grow faster? No. You end up at exactly the same place. So that's one possible thing that's going on. One that was a super big thing a bunch of years ago was myostatin, which is something that goes up and seems to inhibit muscle growth. Right? They found there's what's called the myostatin bull, which is the double muscle bull that's just gigantic. And if you remember Muscle Kid from way back when, he seemed to have a myostatin mutation where he didn't express myostatin, and that caused increased growth. And there was all kinds of stuff trying to figure out how to reduce myostatin in supplements, and none of it went anywhere because it never does. But that might be another one. It's just one of those mechanisms to help constrain muscle growth, because it does. Another one has to do with a bunch of technical stuff with ribosomes, and there's what's called ribosomes. There's translational capacity, which has to do with the number of ribosomes, and there's translational efficiency, which is how well a given ribosome can convert gene expression into proteins. And both of those probably go up with training. And we do know that ribosomes are upregulated after training. We also know that that explains hyperresponders. People who grow better show a greater upregulation in ribosome number, which is part of why they're hyperresponders. There's other possible mechanisms. So another possible cause of the ultimate plateau, there may be an upper limit to how many ribosomes can be made, how efficient they can be, where simply they cannot crank out any more proteins. Again, speculative. So that's another one. One thing that tends to get ignored, and I talked about this in that long protein video, is we know that in response to training, we know that even at rest, there's protein synthesis and there's protein breakdown. And it's the balance of the two that determines if you grow or shrink. Protein synthesis is what's mainly measured. And that's simply because protein breakdown is difficult, technically, to measure. But just because we can't measure it easily doesn't mean we get to ignore it in terms of training or nutrition. But the point of this being that a bigger muscle may experience faster rates of breakdown. So even if you're training and bumping up protein synthesis, if during rest you're getting increases in protein breakdown, you're going to hit a plateau, right? As the muscle fiber gets bigger due to protein synthesis, if protein breakdown increases, once they come into balance, you're not growing anymore. So there's another possibility. A final one, or next to final, I think this is all of them. There is some evidence that once a cell gets too big, it may limit its own growth. Now, this has only been studied in non-muscle fibers as far as I can tell, and we don't know for a fact. But like, for example, when fat cells get big beyond a certain point, we know that they release growth factors that recruit what are called pre-adipocytes, little baby adipocytes, that then grow so you can keep storing fat. But this doesn't seem to really happen in muscle, right? I mean, yeah, there's still lots of debate over fiber splitting and hyperplasia, and it doesn't seem to really happen to a great degree, and certainly not when fibers get big beyond a certain point. The body's like, oh, make new ones. If that's been shown, I'm not aware of it. So it may simply be that once a fiber gets too big, it limits its own growth somehow. And again, this paper looked at a couple speculative mechanisms. One, and this was news to me, is that actually most nutrient utilization in terms of protein and carbs and stuff are deeper inside the muscle fiber. Like if the muscle fiber's here, that's deeper in. So the bigger the muscle fiber gets, it may become more difficult to actually get nutrients to where it's needed to support growth, which is sort of interesting to me. But I don't know what can be done about that. There's, then you also get into the whole satellite cell thing, and there's been some early theorizing that satellite cell number, that it could only support what was called a myonuclear domain, that a given satellite cell could only handle a certain size fiber. So we got into all this issue about, will increasing satellite cell number give more potential for growth? And some data said you have to get satellite cell number increases, and others said you didn't. But regardless, there seems to be an upper limit. So you have all these factors where the fiber may actually become refractory to increases in the genes that are involved in growth and all those anabolic markers. It's possible that as the fiber gets bigger, there's an increase in the number of catabolic markers, and protein breakdown may increase, offsetting any growth potential. We might run into upper limit of ribosomes in terms of the number or how efficient they can actually be. The fiber may just physically get too big, where it somehow, and we don't know how yet, constrains its own size to prevent it from getting too much bigger, for whatever reason. So that's kind of some speculative mechanisms that might all be involved in this. The question is then why? Well, I mean, not why. The question is, can anything be done about it? And this brings me to the final point, which is hormones. Hormones are involved in this, although maybe not as much as people think, which I'm not going to explain what that means, but neither here nor there. And a lot of it, we're going to focus on testosterone, because it certainly, and this paper talks about it indirectly and then directly, right? We know that as we get older, and as men get older and testosterone levels start to go down, typically we lose muscle mass. So it may be that there's a certain amount of testosterone needed to support a given amount of muscle growth. Now, when I say that, you have to realize that testosterone, when it binds to the androgen receptor, is altering gene expression, is probably altering ribosome function. The increase in muscle size with anabolic steroid use could suggest that resting hormone levels may be a limiting factor for muscle growth. Potential downstream effects include an increased number of satellite cells and myonuclei, which are both increased in a dose-dependent manner in response to supraphysiological levels of hormones. And even that ties back to the ribosome thing, because satellite cells and myonuclei set the number of how many ribosomes can be made. And I believe testosterone has been shown to reduce myostatin. It's entirely possible that your resting level of testosterone may be determining your maximum level of muscle growth, and might also explain differences between individuals, the so-called easy gainer and hard gainer, or whatever you want to call it. And we know that drugs get you past it. There was some theorizing years ago that it might inhibit protein breakdown, although I don't know if that's still being argued anymore. So it's hard to separate testosterone levels from all that other stuff I talked about. It may be fundamentally controlling how far that those can. And the paper does talk about some other things. There's something called anabolic resistance that tends to occur with aging that makes muscle more refractory. And they even suggested that maybe maximum muscle growth is just set by being old. I don't think that's really doing it acutely, like the difference between 23 years old and 18, that 4 or 5 years. That's not what's causing it. But they do offer really interesting speculation. That's something I've thought about, which is that maybe early exposure to resistance training, i.e. during puberty, when you're already in that natural anabolic cycle, might allow more potential for growth. Now, this is obviously very hard to study, although I'm sure the Germans, who admittedly juiced up their teen athletes, might have some data on it. But purely anecdotally, I have met people who grew up on a farm doing hard labor and shit like that, and they're big, and they stay big. And if they get into the weight room, they just dominate. And they don't ever seem to lose that muscle mass, even if they stop training. Now, of course, there's a confound. People who work on farms, parents tend to get selected for being big. Their kids are big. But that early training may be causing some relatively permanent changes. Does that allow for more muscle growth than they would otherwise get? Don't know. And obviously, unless you have a time machine, there ain't shit you can do about this. But it's an interesting idea that should follow up on it. Anybody, if you've got twins, do an experiment for me. Train one of them through puberty and the other one not. Let's see what happens. And I do think the testosterone angle is important because we know that once people hit an upper limit, how do you grow more? Well, you start taking steroids. And that will raise the upper limit of muscle size to some degree, depending on how much you take. And when you hit the next plateau, because your testosterone goes from the normal range to double or triple that, well, now that can support a larger amount of muscle mass. But at that dose, it's not like bodybuilders keep growing forever. They hit that plateau as well. And then you add more anabolics or different anabolics or ancillaries like growth hormone and IGF-1 and insulin to start targeting other of these pathways that allows a higher upper threshold of muscle size, but you still run into plateaus, which again does depend on drug dose, right? Arnold took whatever he took. He competed at between 220 and 240, depending on who you ask. 100 to 115 kilos. Dorian was up at 280, about 135 kilos. Lou Ferrigno was about the same, but he was also like 6'10". Guys now, like Big Ramey and some of these big bodybuilders, I know their fucking names. They're competing at 320, damn near 150 kilos, shredded, leaner than Arnold ever was, certainly. Why? More drugs. Just is. That's what it is. So I think the testosterone is a big part of it. And again, with age, testosterone goes down, muscle mass goes down. We know that you take more testosterone, you can get bigger than you would otherwise genetically, and it may be involved in all of this. So that's the speculation. We know there's a plateau. The question is why. We don't really know, but it could be any of those. It could be all of those. And so far, until I come up with, the ribosome training protocol, I'm surprised nobody's done it yet. That's just it. You will grow usually within about 3 to 4 years of proper training, right? People fuck about for 10 years and don't start growing until they actually start doing things right. But that's about it. And as a maximum, men might gain 40 or 45 pounds. On average, probably less than that, depending on, whatever, hormones, ribosomes, androgen receptors, all this other stuff. Women, about half as much. And once you get to that point, you're done. Then as you get older and everything starts to shit the bed, you simply are fighting the long, slow decline to decrepitude, which is where I am now. Hope that helps. For the record, I neither read nor respond to comments on YouTube or Instagram because I don't care. Of course, unlike all the others, I don't delete them if I don't like them. You want to tell me I'm great? Cool. You want to tell me I'm full of shit? Equally fantastic. You want to ask me a question? I'll never see it. I just can't be bothered. However, since I do seem to be doing a regular Q&A, at least for the time being, you can send me questions to questions@bodyrecomposition.com. There's exactly a 0% guarantee that I will read it, much less answer it. That's all part of my charm. See you next time.